Welcome back to the Foundation C# course. We are currently in Module 6, and this lesson, we're going to be covering access modifiers. Now, you've already kind of seen a couple of these, public and private, but we're going to get into a little more about what these are and what these do. So let's start by creating a new project, and we'll make this a console app.NET framework. And then we'll call this the access modifiers demo, an access modifier demo app. And we'll hit create. And then once we're in here, we're going to add our console read line at the end. And we're also going to add a new class or a new class library. So add new project, and we want a class library. We want it to be a .NET Framework class library. Hit next, and we'll call this our demo library. And we'll create, and we'll delete class 1. Okay, I always delete class 1 because I don't want to rename and make a mess of things. It's just easier to delete it and start over. In this case, we're going to create a class. We're going to call this the let's keep it simple and make it the person class. Just person, not person model, even just person. Okay. And we'll make it public. That's the way to use private because we're not returning the actual variable, we're returning a modified version of it. So the public version returns a modified version of the private one. Now, this would defeat the purpose if this right here were public, because then we'd have access to it outside of this person class. So we've said, no, this is only for internal use. Let's make it private. And then the public version will return a modified version of that. Okay, so that's public and private. And we've used those quite a bit, and mostly public just because in general, things are public, it seems like. So, if we create a method to do something like, down here we have say hello, that's public. There's not a reason to hide that behind, and say, okay, it's private and it's only used internally. However, there are times, like with our private SSN, or also if you have a helper method that only does a certain little piece, but you don't ever want to call that directly because it's a certain piece, but it's in the service of a larger whole. Then you want to call that larger whole, not the pieces, because you might forget to call one of the pieces, and that could be a problem. So that's what public and private are, and that's the most common access modifiers. And just to be very, very clear here, let's create a person object, control dot, to add a reference to demo library and add the using statement. Okay, so I've just added a reference here. So if I right clicked on references and said add reference and check this box, that's equivalent of what I just did. And then also went up here and put using demo library at the top. So that's the two steps that just did. So person, let's call it person equals new person. Now if I see person dot, I have first name, say hello, and SSN. Those are the three things I have access to. I do not have access to underscore SSN because that's a private variable. Therefore, I don't have access. Nothing has access outside of this class. So the private variables are declared, and then they are only accessible inside of the curly braces they were declared in. So if I created a private something here, so private string test equals hi, this variable test is only, it's implied, sorry. This variable test is only available inside of this method. Now I couldn't say private because you can't make a public string inside of a method, but this is private to just this method. Okay, so up here, this is private to this class because it's declared outside of a method. So the curly braces that it lives in are these curly braces. Now public is accessible outside of these curly braces because of the public modifier. Hopefully that kind of clicks. Now let's talk about a few more modifiers because there are other options. In fact, there's a total of 4 modifiers, but I really say there's 6 modifiers because 2 of the modifiers have like combined modifiers. So let's talk through what those are. So let's say we had a method. Let's first we'll create a property for last name, just so we have it. Now let's create a method for public void change last name. And the new name, new last name is being passed in. Okay, so this is kind of an important thing to get right is they're going to change their last name, which right now it's a public property. So that'd be kind of a hard thing, except the fact that we can do and this is kind of fun, private set on their last name so that they can't just make changes whenever they feel like it. We can do the same thing for first name. So a private set means it can only be changed where? Inside this class. But it can be read from anywhere. That's public by default. So the last name, we could say, well, let's first of all create a variable up here. A private variable. Let's start with private. We'll modify as we need to. Private variable called former last name, and that's an empty string. But we want to keep track of if their last name changed, we want the former last name. Now we're going to assume for the sake of this demo that the last name only changes once, because it doesn't very often change more than once, but maybe it does. And so maybe we want to have an array of this. If you got married 3 or 4 times and you change your name every time, yes, that would be a case where that could occur. So this is something we want to keep track of at least once. In the real world, we probably have an array here, but let's call it just once in a former last name. This is private, so only this class can access it. Where we want to change their last name, so we're going to say, let's do former last name equals last name. And then we're going to say last name equals new last name, like that. So now we've put the current last name into former last name and the new last name into the last name property. That allows us to change last name without them being able to actually set it directly. This allows for a little more modification or a little bit of chaining logic together. So now it doesn't just change the last name, it also records the previous last name. Now, that's great, but what if we create a new class? Let's do it down here. Public class employee. Well, an employee is a person. So therefore, we're inheriting. And that's fine, that's great. But what if I have a method in employee that is public string get former last name? Because there's a reason why your employer needs to have your former last name. So I go to return, and I say I want to return former last name. Return former last name. And he goes, I can't find that, so I'm going to give you a different one. IntelliSense is trying to override me. So that doesn't work because it's private. The employee class doesn't have access to this private variable. Only the person class does. It only lives inside these curly braces, not these down here. This is where our next modifier type comes in. So instead of private, we have other options. In this case, I want protected. Now that it's protected, I have access to it down here. Well, why is that? Well, protected allows me to access something in the class that I created, so in these curly braces, as well as any class that derives from this class, meaning any child class of person. So employee inherits from employee inherits from person. And so therefore, it gets all of its protected members, it has access to those as well. Now that can be methods and that can be variables too. So you can have access to either one as if they're marked protected. But if I come over here to program.cs and I say person dot, I still don't have that former last name anywhere. I can't access it. Okay, so it's available in my main class and every class that I inherit from that class. And so if I had a grandchild, so if I did a public class manager, which inherits from employee, I can still have access to that former last name. Okay, so I have to do that method. Public string get all names. How about that? And we'll just append them together. So I could say return first name. I have access to that. I have access to last name. And I have access to former last name. Okay? So even though it's a grandchild, that's fine because I inherit from employee, employee inherits from person, therefore I have access to all of person's protected entities. So that's now public, private, and protected. You have 3 out of the 4. Let's pick up the 4th one. So let's create a class I'm going to make this class for now public class, and we'll call it, let's call it data access. And we'll create a method in here. We'll start with public string get connection string. Now, a connection string is usually sensitive data. It's got possibly a username and password in it. These are things you don't want just anyone. Before it, though, it's got to get the connection string. So you'd say string, let's call it con equals data access. Whoops, we got to make it, we got to instantiate it first. So data access, data equals new data access, and then data dot get connection string. Okay, so we can do that there, and that'd be the right way of going about it. Because then over here in our program.cs, we would be saying, no, don't call connection string directly, but call person.save person, which is going to call the connection string internally, talk to the database, save the information, and then wrap up. And that's the way we want to do it. But how do I do that since this class doesn't inherit from person or from employee or manager? So I can't just say, oh, well, then we should, inherit and then do the protected, because I don't inherit from any of these things, and I shouldn't. So we have the ability to say, actually, this is internal. And so is this. So now in my person class, if I expand this back out and come down here, not a problem to get the connection string and not a problem to connect to the data access. But over here, I now have an inaccessibility. It's inaccessible due to its protection level. You can't talk directly to data access in the user interface now, but any class in this whole assembly, it's called. So anything in the demo library, that's the assembly. The project is the assembly. So anything in this assembly can talk to data access, but nothing outside of it can. So you can use as many classes as you want, can have access to data access, but you won't have any issue with this sensitive data getting outside of the demo library because you can't talk to it. Okay, so that's internal. Internal means anything in the same assembly. So we have the idea of public, which is anybody can talk to it. We have private, which is only inside where it was declared. So for this private right here, it was declared inside these curly braces, which is a person. Therefore, only this class has access to it. We have the idea of protected, which means it's available or accessible inside the class where it was created, as well as any classes that derive from that class, meaning now employee and manager. And finally, we have internal, which is for the entire assembly to have access to. So you may think that's plenty of different modifiers, but let's take, for instance, if we came over to our access modifiers, go to our program.cs, And I'm going to create a new class. Let's call this class the CEO class. So public class CEO. And I'm going to inherit from, let's do it from manager. Okay. And now in here, I am going to want to talk to my data access. So I'm going to have a public void get connection info. For whatever reason, the CEO needs a connection info. So we're going to say data access dot, data equals new data access. Can escape that. And it says, no, you can't do that. It's inaccessible due to its protection level. So even though I'm inheriting from manager, which is inside this assembly, I still don't have access to that internal. Okay. So I do have access to former last name. That's protected. So I can say former last name, and that's available to me. But I don't have access to my data access because it's not in that assembly, even though I'm inheriting from it. So there's a new modifier you can use that's a combination of the two. So let's change this internal to be protected internal. And we'll do the same for this method right here. We have to make this public now. So public. So this modifier is a little trickier. You have to have the class labeled as public, but then you can mark the methods as protected internal, which means we still have access down here in our class because it's still in the same assembly, because that's what internal means. Okay. We also have the idea of protected, which means that it is available in anything that is inherited. Now, I'm not inheriting from, this is not the best example, but I'm not inheriting from data access, but let's just say I did. So now because it's public, I have this, but I still can't do data dot. There's nothing to do because it was protected internal. However, if I came over here and create a class where I said public, let's go make it private class, and we'll have it be modified data access, inherits from data access. Now, what I can do is, public. I always forget the class versus the classes are basically public and private, but then you can modify it other ways. So not public and private. They're not private and they're not protected internal because those modifications don't really work because they're not defined inside a class themselves. So basically you end up with public or internal or protected. Okay. But in this case, we're going to do public, and that's fine. And now we have access to see, if I come over here, this get connection string. So I can call this from a different method. Let's create a method, public void. Let's call it, I can't do I'm snooping, but get unsecure connection info. Okay. And then from here, I can say get connection string. Okay. So even though I'm not in the right assembly or the same assembly, I can still have access to this because I'm inheriting from data access. That's what the protected internal allows. It allows for internal things to have access, and it allows for things that are inheriting from data access to have access. So in theory, you can kind of bypass And this is why you got to be careful with your modifications. You could bypass this internal thought by creating this class, and then here that's public now. So I could say modified data access down here. And now I can say data access dot get unsecure connection info. So there's actually a way of getting internal. And certain variables like your social security number, yes, they should be private so that nobody has access to it to somehow create a security flaw in your system. Just note that this is more of a convenience security, not necessarily a lockdown tight, everything is totally secure once we do this security. Okay? So with that being done, let's look at the last modifier, and that's private protected. The idea behind private protected is that you have access to something if it's in the class or a derived class in the current assembly. So here we have access in employee to former last name. But maybe you don't want, and that's protected, but maybe you don't want it to be available if I were to come over here and inherit. So if I create a class over here and I said public class, and let's call it, well, I have manager already. We'll use manager or CEO. So I have access to former last name. I already did that. So I just modify it to something else. And you're like, yeah, I don't like the idea of my UI having access to that. I just want things that are inheriting from it that are in the same assembly. Therefore, what I can do is change this to be private protected. And now I still have access to it here. I still have access to it down here, all in the same assembly. But over here, it says, no, you don't have access to that. It's only for things that inherit from person. That's what we've been doing for a long time now. But start with that. And then as you find, hey, I want to make a little, I don't want this to be available everywhere, or I want this to be available some places, but not everywhere. Then you can bring in your protected or your internal. Okay. It's really up to you how you do that. But just, like I said, don't go crazy with this. Just know that they're available. Now I'm going to put in the program.cs, I'm going to put at the very top a URL. And that's to the Microsoft documentation for these access modifiers. What that looks like is this. And this is actually the stuff we've been going over is all been right here. So you have your public, protected, internal, private, and private protected. Those are the modifiers that are available in C#. And it kind of explains what each does. Now we've gone into more detail in this video and kind of demoed how that would actually play out. But that's a great reference to go back to as you need to kind of refresh your brain on what does protected really mean. Okay. So with that, let's clean this up. So let's do our control dots to move to the classes or the files. So we'll move our classes to the files, and then over here as well, because we do not want to have just one file. That's ugly and horrible. All right, so now we have our person in our person.cs file, and everything else is in its own file. Okay, so that is the end of our lesson. Let's look at our tip for today. And the tip is to identify who needs an object in order to understand which modifier it needs. So if you don't understand who needs an object, maybe start with private and then expand out to public eventually if you have to. But if you know who needs something, that kind of will help you determine or shape what modifier it might need. All right. And so your homework is to create a class library in a console application, create a public class with members, and have different modifiers on them. You don't have to make this a working class. You notice we didn't actually run this application? That's because it wasn't about running it. It was about seeing how those different modifiers worked and when they were available, when they weren't. Do the same thing, just with different class names. So create a class, create some modifiers inside of it with the different types, and then maybe create some inherited classes, kind of like we did. And just try it out. Get a feel for when to use what and how it works. Once you've done that, come on back for the next lesson.